Chapter 1. The Morning of Dreams. A house alive with anticipation. The sun crept over the horizon on September 28, 2025, bathing a quiet Connecticut suburb in a soft golden glow. Leaves in shades of crimson and amber danced in the crisp breeze. A perfect backdrop for the day Sarah Matthews had dreamed of since childhood. Inside her family's charming two-story house, the air hummed with excitement. Downstairs, the clatter of coffee cups mingled with the chatter of bridesmaids. While upstairs, Sarah stood before a full-length mirror in her childhood bedroom, her breath catching at the sight of her reflection. The ivory wedding dress, a vision of lace and silk she'd sketched with crayons at age 10, hugged her figure like a glove, its delicate details shimmering in the morning light streaming through the window. Her auburn hair cascaded in loose, elegant waves beneath a sheer veil, pinned with a pearl comb her grandmother had worn decades ago. On the dresser sat a bouquet of white roses, their petals still dewy from the florist's cooler, their scent weaving through the room like a quiet promise. After 18 months of meticulous planning, countless Pinterest boards, vendor calls, and late-night debates over seating charts, her wedding day had arrived, and it was everything she'd envisioned. Almost at her feet sprawled Max, her 13-year-old German shepherd, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. His amber eyes, flecked with the wisdom of years, followed her every move with an intensity that sent a faint shiver down her spine. Max wasn't just a pet, he was her shadow, her soulmate in fur, her family. She'd rescued him from Riverside Animal Shelter when he was a scrawny, 8-month-old pup. All floppy ears and boundless energy, his ribs poking through his matted coat. That day, he'd pressed his nose to her hand through the kennel bars, and she'd known he was hers. He'd repaid her 1,000 times over, chewing up her ex-boyfriend's hoodie after her first heartbreak, napping beside her through college finals, and bounding joyfully the day she met Michael her at a local park 3 years ago. Today, though, Max was different. No tail wag greeted her usual morning chatter. No playful nudge nudged her hand. He just lay there, watching her with a quiet stillness that felt off. "What do you think, buddy?" Sarah asked, twirling slightly so the lace caught the light. "Is Michael a keeper?" Max's ears twitched at Michael's name, a name that usually sent him bounding to the door, barking for the man who'd become his second favorite human, but he didn't move. She knelt, her dress pulling around her like a cloud, and scratched behind his ears. His fur felt warm, almost feverish, and his breath came in soft, uneven huffs. "You're just picking up on my nerves, aren't you?" she murmured, forcing a smile. "Big day for both of us." Downstairs, the house was a symphony of controlled chaos. Bridesmaids in pale blue dresses flitted about, their laughter bouncing off the walls as the makeup artist, a cheerful woman named Carla with a riot of purple curls, dabbed blush on their cheeks. Elizabeth, Sarah's mother, paced the living room in her sensible heels, her Bluetooth headset glowing blue as she barked orders at the wedding planner. The caterers, late with the appetizers, and tell the band to tune that guitar. "I heard it was flat at the rehearsal." Her voice cut through the din like a conductor's baton, orchestrating the morning with military precision. Through it all, Max stayed glued to Sarah's side, his joints creaking faintly as he shadowed her from bedroom to hallway to the top of the stairs. He wore a special collar, tiny black bow tie Michael had picked out at a pet store months ago, joking that Max would be the real star of the show. Sarah had insisted he'd be part of the ceremony, much to Elizabeth's initial horror. "A dog at a wedding? Really, Sarah?" She'd huffed, hands on her hips. But Michael, with his warm hazel eyes and easy laugh, had sided with Sarah. "His family, Liz. He gets a VIP spot right up front with us." They'd laughed over the bow tie, Michael teasing that Max might upstage the groom. "He's ready to walk you down the aisle," Jenny, Sarah's maid of honor, said with a grin as she adjusted her own dress in the hallway mirror. Her blonde curls bounced as she knelt beside Max, stroking his graying muzzle. "Look at this little gentleman." Sarah laughed, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "He'd better be. I fought Mum tooth and nail for this." But as she adjusted her veil, a flicker of unease crept in. Max had been off for days, eating less, moving slower, spending hours curled up in his bed by the fireplace instead of chasing shadows in the backyard like he used to. She'd noticed his water bowl sitting untouched, his favorite treats ignored on the counter. She'd meant to take him to the vet, but the wedding had swallowed her time guest lists, floral arrangements, a last-minute crisis when the bakery mixed up the cake flavors. He's fine, she told herself, brushing off the gnawing worry. Just old age, catching up. 13's a good run for a shepherd, right? Chapter 2. The Drive. A quiet warning. We need to move. Elizabeth called from the bottom of the stairs, her watch glinting as she tapped it impatiently. The photographer wants shots at St. Patrick's before the ceremony, and traffic's already backing up on Route 7. Sarah, sweetheart, let's go. Sarah gathered her skirts, the silk rustling like whispers against her legs, and turned to Max. Come on, boy, time to go. He rose slowly, his movements stiff and deliberate, and followed her to Jenny's car, a sleek silver SUV parked in the driveway. The bridesmaids piled in, their chatter a bright hum, but Sarah slid into the backseat alone with Max, needing a moment of quiet amid the storm. The drive to the historic St. Patrick's Church was short, just 10 minutes, but her stomach twisted with every mile. A knot of nerves she couldn't untangle. Max rested his head in her lap, his breath warm against her silk gloves, his body heavier than usual. Normally, he'd sit upright in the car, nose pressed to the window, ears perked as he watched the world blur by. Today, he clung to her, his amber eyes half-lidded, his weight pressing into her thighs like an anchor. She ran her fingers through his fur, tracing the familiar patches where black faded to gray, and whispered, "You okay, buddy? Big day for you too, huh?" He let out a soft huff, almost a sigh, and pressed closer, his nose nudging her hand. "You're sure he's all right?" Jenny asked, glancing at them in the rearview mirror as she navigated the tree-lined streets. "He's not his usual bouncy self." Sarah nodded, though her smile faltered. "He's been a little off lately, leaping more, not eating much. I think he's just picking up on all the excitement. You know how sensitive he is." But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that it was more than that. She'd seen the signs: his reluctance to climb the stairs, the way he'd linger by her side instead of exploring the yard. She'd meant to call Dr. Peterson, but every time she reached for the phone, another wedding task pulled her away. They arrived at the church with an hour to spare, the garden a vision of late September magic. Golden sunlight filtered through crimson and amber leaves, casting dappled shadows on the cobblestone path that wound through the grounds. The air smelled of earth and fading flowers, a crisp bite promising autumn's full embrace. St. Patrick's, with its ivy-clad stone walls and arched stained-glass windows, stood like a sentinel over the scene, its steeple piercing the sky. Sarah had chosen it for its history. Her grandparents had married here. Her parents too, and for the way it felt like stepping into a storybook. The photographer, a wiry man named Tom with a camera slung around his neck and a perpetual squint, was already setting up by an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching like a canopy over the grass. "Perfect light," he muttered, adjusting his lens. "We've got maybe 20 minutes before it shifts. Let's start with the bride alone, then bring in the wedding party." Sarah stepped into place, her dress trailing across the grass, the veil fluttering in the breeze like a ghost. Her father, John, stood nearby, holding Max's leash, his grey suit crisp against the autumn backdrop. Jenny fluffed her train, fussing over the folds, while Elizabeth hovered at the edge, still murmuring into her headset about the reception timeline. The camera clicked once, twice, then stopped. Max moved. Chapter 3. The Stand. A dog's defiance. With a slow, deliberate grace that belied his age, Max pulled free of John's grip, the leash slipping through his fingers like water. Before anyone could react, he walked to Sarah Cheese, step measured, purposeful, and planted himself firmly in front of her. A wall of fur and muscle blocking Tom's shot. His body pressed against her legs, the tiny bow tie on his collar tilting slightly. His head tilted up so those amber eyes locked onto hers with a quiet, unshakable urgency. "Max, move aside, buddy," Sarah said gently, nudging him with her knee. He didn't budge, not an inch. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He just stood there, resolute, his gaze piercing through her like a plea she couldn't decipher. "Max, come here," John called, clapping his hands sharply, his voice carrying over the rustle of leaves. Nothing. Max didn't even flick an ear. "Maybe he needs a walk," Jenny suggested, reaching for the leash dangling from John's hand. She stepped closer, her heels sinking into the soft earth, but as she neared, Max leaned harder into Sarah, his weight nearly knocking her off balance in her delicate wedding heels. "Max, what's wrong?" Sarah dropped to her knees, heedless of the grass staining her dress, and cupped his face in her hands. Her veil slipped slightly, pulling around her shoulders, but she didn't care. She looked into his eyes, those soulful pools she'd known for 13 years, saw something she hadn't noticed before. His breathing was shallow, ragged, his chest rising and falling too fast. A faint tremor ran through his legs, barely perceptible but there, and his eyes shimmered with a mix of emotions she couldn't name: fear, pain, love, something deeper. "Sarah, we need these photos," Elizabeth snapped, her voice tight with exasperation as she glanced at her watch. "Guests are arriving in 30 minutes, and the planner's already texting me about the parking situation." But Sarah barely heard her. Max rested his head on her shoulder, a gesture he'd done since puppyhood when he was sick or scared. A silent request for comfort, and his warmth seeped through her dress, too hot, too heavy against her skin. She pressed her cheek to his fur, inhaling the familiar scent of him, earth and pine, and a hint of the shampoo she'd used last weekend, felt her throat tighten. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice cracking like brittle glass. "He's not okay." Jenny knelt beside them, her pale blue dress brushing the grass as she pressed a hand to Max's side. "His heart's racing, Sarah," she said, her brow furrowing. "Like, really racing way faster than it should be." John stepped closer, his face creasing with worry as he adjusted his glasses. "Should we call the vet? He doesn't look right." "But the wedding," Elizabeth began, her hands fluttering in frustration, then fell silent as Sarah's tear-streaked face turned to her. The crowd around them, the bridesmaids whispering, Tom lowering his camera, the planner hovering with her clipboard, faded into a blur. Sarah fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Dr. Peterson, Max's vet since the day she'd brought him home all those years ago. Dr. Peterson's emergency line, "This is Kate," came the familiar voice on the other end, calm and steady. "Kate, it's Sarah Matthews. Something's wrong with Max. He's struggling to breathe, his heart's racing, he's acting strange. Please, I need help." A pause stretched across the line. "Sarah, aren't you getting married today?" "Yes," but her voice broke, a sob catching in her throat. "Please, bring him in now. Dr. Peterson's here, doing paperwork. He'll see Max right away." Sarah looked up at the stunned faces around her, her parents, Jenny, Tom, frozen mid-shot, the wedding planner, whispering urgently into her headset about contingency plans. John knelt beside her, his hand heavy on her shoulder, his voice low and firm. "Go, Sarah. That dog's been by your side through everything: your first heartbreak, when that jerk, Tommy, dumped you. Losing Nana when you wouldn't leave your room for days. Meeting Michael at the park when Max dragged you over to say hi. He's family. You don't abandon family when they need you." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she threw her arms around him, her veil catching on his suit jacket. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Chapter 4: The Race, A Bride's Resolve. Jenny helped Sarah to her feet, her dress now smudged with grass and strands of Max's fur, and guided her to the car, her arm steady around her friend's waist. Max staggered behind, his steps faltering but his determination clear. He stayed as close to Sarah as he could, pressing against her legs whenever she paused. John stayed back to call Michael, his voice steady as he explained the situation to the groom, while Elizabeth, after a moment's hesitation, took charge of the growing crowd at the church. "There's a family emergency," she announced, her tone shifting from frantic to composed. "Please bear with us, we'll update you soon." The drive to Riverside Veterinary Clinic was a tense, silent blur. The world outside the car windows, a smear of autumn colors. Sarah sat in the back seat, Max's head in her lap, her wedding dress billowing around them like a cloud. She kept one hand on his chest, feeling the erratic thump of his heart beneath her fingers, while the other stroked his graying muzzle, tracing the familiar lines of his face. "Hold on, buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've got you. We're almost there." "Remember when you first got him?" Jenny asked, her voice soft as she gripped the wheel, weaving through traffic with practiced ease. "He ate my favorite sneakers that first week, those red high tops I saved up for all summer." Sarah managed a faint smile, her eyes never leaving Max. "And Mum's gardening glove, she was so mad she threatened to send him back. And that hideous hat Aunt Linda gave me with the plastic cherry, she swore he did it on purpose." "He did us all a favor with that one," Jenny quipped, glancing at her in the rearview mirror with a small, sad smile. "He was a terror, back then, chewing everything, digging up the yard. But he'd curl up next to you every night like he knew you needed him." "He did," Sarah said softly, her fingers brushing the bow tie on his collar. "He always knew." They pulled up to the clinic in record time, tires crunching on the gravel lot as Jenny parked haphazardly near the entrance. Dr. Peterson waited at the door, his gray hair tousled from a morning of paperwork, his eyebrows shooting up at the sight of Sarah in her wedding dress. He said nothing, though just waved them inside with a quick, practiced motion, and helped Jenny lift Max onto the exam table, his hands gentle but firm. The wait stretched into an agonizing eternity. Sarah paced the small room, her dress swishing with each turn like a metronome of anxiety, the hem picking up dust from the tiled floor. Jenny sat in a plastic chair, texting updates to Michael and the wedding party. "At the vet, Max is sick. Wedding on hold. We'll keep you posted." Sarah's veil trailed behind her, catching on the edge of a cabinet, and she yanked it free with a frustrated tug, stuffing it into her purse. All she could see was Max lying on that cold table, his chest rising and falling too fast, his eyes searching for her through the half-open door. Chapter 5. The Verdict. A Heart's Last Stand. Finally, Dr. Peterson returned, his face etched with sorrow, his white coat wrinkled from hours bent over charts. "Sarah, sit down," he said gently, pulling up a stool across from her. Her knees buckled, and Jenny steadied her into a chair, her hand gripping Sarah's tightly. "Max has heart failure," Dr. Peterson began, his voice soft but steady, the kind of tone honed by years of delivering hard truths. "It's early stages, but at 13, it's progressed faster than we'd expect, even for a German Shepherd." The excitement today, all the noise and movement, likely pushed him over the edge. "He's been trying to tell you something was wrong, staying close, blocking you because he trusts you most." Sarah's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. "But he was fine last week. He chased a squirrel in the yard, he ate his dinner." "Dogs are masters at hiding pain, especially for those they love," Dr. Peterson said, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "He's been compensating, pushing through for you. At 13, he's already beaten the odds for his breed. Most don't make it past 10 or 11. We can start meds to manage his symptoms. Make him comfortable, but with his age and the severity, we're talking months, not years." Tears flooded her eyes as she gripped Jenny's hand, her nails digging into her friend's palm. "I'm staying with him," she said firmly, her voice trembling but resolute. "When I adopted him, I promised I stood in that shelter and swore he'd never be alone when he needed me. He's always been there for me, every breakup, every late night, every big moment. When Nana died, he slept by my bed for weeks. When I met Michael, he dragged me across the park to say hi. I can't leave him now." Dr. Peterson nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I figured you'd say that. Let's get him started on the meds for fluids first, then some pills you'll take home. He's a fighter, this one. Always has been." Chapter 6. A Wedding Reborn. Love in the Chaos. Dr. Peterson hooked Max to an IV, explaining the treatment plan as Sarah sat on the floor beside him, her dress a crumpled halo around her on the cold tiles. She stroked his muzzle, whispering promises as the medication dripped into his vein. "You're my best boy. Always will be. While Jenny scribbled notes on her phone for the follow-up care, Sarah's own phone buzzed against her thigh, a text from Michael lighting up the screen. "How's he doing?" Her hands shook as she typed back, "Heart failure. I'm so sorry about the wedding." His reply came instantly. "Don't be, I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, the clinic door swung open with a jangle of bells, and Michael strode in, his tuxedo rumpled from the drive. His best man, Kevin, trailing behind with a sheepish grin. Sarah looked up, mascara streaking her cheeks, hair falling loose from its careful updo dress wrinkled beyond repair. "I'm so sorry," she began, her voice breaking. Michael dropped beside her, kneeling on the tile, and wiped her tears with his thumb. "Hey, remember what I said when I proposed? Under that oak tree, with Max chewing on my shoelaces. I love you because you love with your whole heart fiercely, without holding back. Max matters more than any plan, any fancy venue. He's why we're here." He scratched Max's ears, earning a weak tail thump that echoed in the quiet room. Kevin cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly in his polished shoes. We've got an idea. John called the minister, he's willing to come here. Your parents are on board, and I think we can make it work." Jenny nodded eagerly, already on her phone. "I called the florist there, sending over some roses from the reception stock. The bakery's dropping off a few cupcakes too. It's not your dream wedding, but—" Sarah glanced at Max, his bow-tie collar slightly askew. His eyes still locked on her with that quiet trust that had carried her through a decade of life's storms. "Really, only if you want to," Michael said, his hand finding hers. "We can wait, reschedule, do it all over." "No," Sarah interrupted, a watery smile breaking through her tears. "This is perfect. Max was there when we met at the park. He practically tackled you with that muddy tennis ball. He was there when you proposed, barking like he was saying yes for me. He should be here now. It's us." 2 hours later, the clinic's waiting room transformed into a makeshift chapel. Sarah's dress was a mess, grass stains mingling with fur, her veil long discarded in her purse. Michael's tux was dusty from the floor, his tie loosened from sitting beside Max during the wait. Their small audience, John, Elizabeth, Jenny, Kevin, and the minister, a kind-eyed man named Reverend Paul, huddled close. Chairs dragged in from the staff break room. The florist had delivered a handful of white roses, which Jenny tucked into Sarah's hair, and a box of cupcakes sat on the reception desk, their frosting slightly smudged from the rush. Max lay at their feet, fur dripping into his leg, his bow tie a quirky contrast to the medical tape holding the needle in place. Reverend Paul's voice was soft but steady as he began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Michael squeezed Sarah's hand, his vows coming straight from the heart. "I promise to love you through every unexpected turn, every detour, every moment that doesn't go to plan, because that's where the real stuff happens." His eyes flicked to Max, a grin tugging at his lips. Sarah's voice trembled as she spoke. "I promise to stand by you, to love you with everything I have, just like Max has loved me unconditionally, no matter what." When Michael leaned in to kiss her, Max let out a quiet woof, his tail thumping once against the floor, and laughter mingled with tears rippled through the room. Elizabeth dabbed her eyes with a tissue, whispering to John, maybe the dog wasn't such a bad idea after all. Carla, the makeup artist, who'd insisted on tagging along to fix the bride's face, snapped a photo with her phone, muttering, "This is going viral, I swear." Chapter 7. The Secret Unveiled. A Guardian's Instinct. That night, instead of a grand reception at the elegant venue they'd booked, Sarah and Michael sat on their apartment floor, Max stretched out between them on his favorite blanket. They shared takeout Chinese from cardboard containers, Kung Pao chicken for Michael, lo mein for Sarah, feeding Max tiny bites of plain chicken Dr. Peterson had approved. His tail thumped weakly against the hardwood, his eyes brighter now with the meds kicking in. "You know," Michael said, watching Max gently take a piece from Sarah's fingers, "when I met you two at the park that day, I knew he was part of the deal. Muddy paws and all. I didn't realize he'd teach me so much about love, about showing up, no matter what." Sarah leaned over to kiss him, careful not to jostle Max, who'd nestled closer to her side. He's been showing us how all along loyalty, no matter what. Through every breakup, every fight we've had, every quiet night, he's my constant. But the story didn't end with their unconventional wedding. A week later, as Sarah sat at their kitchen table, sorting through wedding photos, snapshots of their vows in the clinic, Max's bow tie stealing the frame, her mother called, her voice trembling over the line. "Sarah, you need to come home. Now, it's urgent." At her parents' house, Elizabeth led her up the creaky attic stairs, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. A battered cardboard box sat open on the floor, its contents spilling out yellowed letters. Faded photos, a child's drawing of a house with a crooked chimney. Elizabeth handed her an envelope, the paper brittle with age, addressed in Grandma Rose's spidery handwriting. "To Sarah, to be opened after your wedding." Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, her mother hovering nervously behind her. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, you're married now, a wife, a woman I'm so proud of. I hope your day was everything you dreamed, full of love and light. But there's something I never told you, something I couldn't until now, until you were ready to carry it. Your father's brother, my son David, didn't die in a car accident like we told you kids. He was troubled, sick in his mind, obsessed with our family's legacy. He believed there was hidden wealth, land, money, some treasure he'd conjured in his delusions that belonged to him alone. 20 years ago, he vanished after a fight with your grandfather, swearing he'd return one day to claim what was his. I've always feared he might target you, my sweet girl, especially on a day like your wedding, when we'd all be distracted, our guards down. I don't know if he's still out there, but if anything strange happens, trust your instincts and trust Max. He's more than a dog. He's your guardian, sent to you for a reason. I love you always, Grandma Rose." Sarah's blood ran cold, the letter slipping from her fingers to the dusty floor. "Mum, what does this mean?" "Uncle David, he's alive." Elizabeth's face paled, her hands twisting together. David was unhinged. He'd rant about the family inheritance, some nonsense about a fortune buried on Grandpa's old farm, which was just a patch of dirt when we sold it. He got violent once, broke into the house looking for proof. After he disappeared, we told everyone he'd died in a crash to protect you and your brother. I hoped he was gone for good. Your grandmother never believed it. She'd wake up from nightmares about him coming back. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep, the letter's words looping through her mind like a haunting refrain. Max's actions replayed in vivid detail, his clinginess all week, his refusal to let her walk down that garden path at the church. Had he sensed more than his own illness? Had those amber eyes seen a shadow she couldn't? The next morning, as dawn broke over their quiet street, a knock jolted them awake. Michael stumbled to the door, still in his pajamas, while Sarah hovered behind him, Max at her heels. A man stood on their porch, tall, gaunt, his dark hair streaked with grey, his eyes eerily like John's, but sharper, colder. Sarah Matthews. His voice was rough, gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I'm David, your uncle. Heard you got married last week. Thought I'd drop by to congratulate you." Michael stepped forward, his broad shoulders squaring protectively. "What do you want?" David smirked, his gaze flicking past Michael to Sarah, then down to Max, who'd staggered to his feet despite his frailty. "Just to see my niece. Been a long time, and that dog heard, he's quite the star of the show." His tone dripped with something dark, mocking, his hand twitching at his side, as if reaching for something in his coat pocket. Max growled a low guttural sound Sarah hadn't heard in months, his frail body trembling with effort as he positioned himself between her and the stranger. His ears flattened, his lips curling just enough to show teeth, a fierce spark flaring in his dimming eyes. David's smirk faltered, his hand freezing mid-motion, and he took a step back, his boots scuffing the porch. "Guess I'll catch you later," he muttered, turning sharply and disappearing down the street, his shadow swallowed by the morning mist. Sarah sank to the floor, pulling Max close, her arms trembling as she buried her face in his fur. "You knew," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You were protecting me from him, from everything." "My good boy." Michael knelt beside her, his hand on her back, his jaw tight, as he stared after David's retreating figure. "He's not coming back," he said firmly. "Not with Max here and not with me." Chapter 8. The Precious Months. A life measured in moments. Max's meds brought them 6 fragile, beautiful months, 6 months of quiet joys and tender sorrows. The 4 and pills stabilized his heart for a while, giving him bursts of his old self. On good days, they'd take him to the park where they'd met Michael, his tail wagging as he sniffed the grass, his bow tie replaced with a simple red bandana that fluttered in the breeze. He'd chase a tennis ball a few steps before tiring, collapsing into Sarah's lap with a contented huff, his eyes bright with mischief. On bad days, they'd curl up together on the couch, Sarah reading aloud from her old college books, Jane Austen mostly, because Max seemed to like the rhythm while Michael cooked dinner. The smell of garlic and rosemary filling their small apartment, they adjusted their lives around him, a dance of care and love. Michael took the early shift at his carpentry job so he could be home by noon, while Sarah cut back her hours at the library, working remotely when Max needed her close. They'd trade off staying with him on the days he couldn't be alone, celebrating the small victories, a full meal eaten, a wag of the tail while comforting him through the harder moments when his breathing grew labored or his legs gave out mid-step. Max's spirit never wavered. He'd still greet them at the door when they came home, his tail thumping against the floor instead of leaping up like he used to. He'd still beg for treats with those soulful eyes, nudging Sarah's hand until she relented with a sliver of cheese. At night, he'd insist on sleeping by their bed, his snores a steady lullaby, his presence a comfort that wrapped around them like a blanket. One quiet spring evening, as the first buds bloomed outside their window, Max grew restless. He moved between them, nuzzling Sarah's hand, pressing his head to Michael's knee as if checking they were both there, both safe. His breathing turned shallow, his eyes dimming with a soft acceptance. They called Dr. Peterson, who arrived at their home with his black bag, his face heavy with understanding. They sat on the living room floor, Max's head cradled in Sarah's lap, Michael's strong hand stroking his back. Dr. Peterson administered the injection, his voice a murmur as he explained each step, giving them time to say goodbye. "Thank you," Sarah sobbed, pressing her face to Max's fur, inhaling his scent one last time. "For saving me that day at the church, for leading me to Michael, for teaching us what love really means, unconditional, fierce, forever. Thank you for choosing me all those years ago." Michael's voice broke as he added, "You're the best of us, buddy. Rest, know you've earned it." Max's eyes met theirs, a final flicker of love shining through, and then he slipped away, peaceful at last, his body still against them. They held each other as Dr. Peterson quietly packed up, tears streaming down their faces. "He gave us everything," Michael said, his voice thick with grief. "Even at the end, he made sure we were together." Later, as the house settled into an aching silence, Sarah sorted through their wedding photos. She paused on one Jenny had snapped in the clinic, her and Michael exchanging vows, both gazing down at Max as he looked up with pure, unwavering love. "He knew," she said softly, tracing his image with her finger. "That day, when he stopped me, he was making sure we understood what mattered. Not the dress, not the church, just us." Chapter 9. A Legacy Reborn. Love Beyond Loss. A year later, on a crisp October afternoon, Sarah and Michael stood outside Riverside Animal Shelter, the same place where she'd found Max 14 years before. The wound of his loss had softened over months of grieving nights spent clutching his old blanket, days avoiding the park until the memories stung less, but now they felt ready to open their hearts again. "You sure about this?" Michael asked, squeezing her hand, his hazel eyes searching hers. Sarah touched the locket around her neck, a tiny photo of Max tucked inside next to a lock of his fur. "He taught us love's worth it, no matter how long you get," she said, her voice steady. "We can't replace him, but we can honor him, give another dog what he gave us." Inside, the shelter hummed with the familiar sounds of barking, and the faint smell of antiseptic and straw. They walked past kennels of eager puppies and sleek young dogs, their tails wagging like metronomes, until they reached the end of the row. Here, in the last kennel, lay Duke, a 10-year-old golden retriever with grey fur around his muzzle and gentle brown eyes that watched them with quiet curiosity. His name card read, Duke, age 10. Surrendered due to owner's move to nursing home. Sweet temperament, mild arthritis. Most folks want puppies, the shelter worker, a young woman named Mia with a ponytail and a clipboard, explained as she noticed their interest. Duke's been here for months. He's a love bug, but his age scares people off. He'll need meds for his joints, and he's not up for long hikes anymore. Sarah knelt by the kennel door, her jeans brushing the concrete, and Duke ambled over, his tail wagging slowly as he pressed his nose to her hand through the bars. His fur was soft, his eyes warm, and something in his gaze reminded her of Max, not the wild puppy energy, but the steady, knowing presence. He's perfect, she said, tears brimming as she looked up at Michael. Michael nodded, crouching beside her to scratch Duke's ears. He's got that same look, like he's already decided we're his. That night, Duke settled into their home, as if he'd always belonged. He sniffed Max's old bed by the fireplace, a worn fleece cushion with a faint dent from years of use, and curled up in it without hesitation, his soft snores filling the room. Sarah and Michael watched from the couch, a bowl of popcorn between them, as Duke dreamed, his paws twitching slightly. Some people think we're crazy, Sarah said, resting her head on Michael's shoulder. Adopting another old dog, knowing we'll lose him sooner rather than later. Michael pulled her closer, his arm warm around her. But Max showed us it's not about the years, it's about the depth. Duke's already proving that, just by being here. Look at him, he's home. Chapter 10. A Family's Story. Max's enduring gift. Years later, their small apartment grew into a bustling home with the addition of two bright-eyed girls, Lily, age 6, with Sarah's auburn curls, and Emma, 4, with Michael's hazel eyes. On quiet evenings, they'd climb onto their parents' laps, tugging at Sarah's sleeve with sticky fingers, begging for the story they'd heard a dozen times but never tired of. Tell us about Max, they'd chirp, their voices overlapping in excitement. The wedding dog, Sarah would smile, pulling down Max's bow-tie collar from its place on the wall. Now joined by Duke's faded red bandana, both hanging beside a framed photo of their clinic wedding. It wasn't a perfect day. She'd begin settling Lily on her knee, while Emma nestled against Michael. Not the way I'd planned it, with a big church and a fancy dress and a dance floor full of people. But it was ours because Max made sure we knew what really mattered. She'd tell them how Max stopped her that day in the church garden, his stubborn stand forcing her to see he was sick. How they'd raced to the vet, her dress a mess, and married in a waiting room with cupcakes instead of a tiered cake. How Max had growled at a stranger named David, protecting her from a danger she hadn't even known existed. And how, months later, he'd left them with a lesson etched into their hearts. Love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up, no matter what. Duke came next, Michael would add, ruffling Emma's hair as she clutched a stuffed dog that looked suspiciously like Max. He wasn't Max, but he carried on what Max started, keeping us warm, keeping us whole. The girls would listen, wide-eyed, tracing the bow tie with their small fingers, asking questions that grew sharper with each retelling. Did Max really know Uncle David was bad? Lily once asked, her brow furrowed. Did he smell him or something? Maybe, Sarah said, exchanging a glance with Michael. Dogs know things we don't, they feel the world in ways we can't. Max always knew when I needed him, even before I did. Each anniversary, they'd pile into the car, Sarah, Michael, the girls, and later, a third dog. A wiry terrier mix named Scout they'd adopted at age 8 and drive to Riverside Animal Shelter. They'd bring donations, bags of kibble, stacks of blankets, and spend the afternoon playing with the senior dogs, still waiting for homes. Their grey muzzles and gentle eyes a mirror of Max and Duke. This is Max's gift, Sarah would tell the girls as they tossed a ball for a limping Labrador. He taught us to see the ones who need love the most, even when it's hard. Above their fireplace, beside the wedding photo of Sarah and Michael gazing at Max, hung a simple wooden plaque, its words carved by Michael's steady hands. Sometimes love means letting go of perfect plans. For perfection lies in the hearts that guide us home. Below it, Max's bow tie collar hung alongside Duke's bandana and Scout's chewed-up leash. A trio of symbols marking the capacity of their hearts to love, to lose, and to love again. Max's legacy wasn't just saving Sarah that wedding day from a threat she'd never seen coming, or even from the heartbreak of losing him too soon. It was teaching them that living all its messy, unexpected, fleeting glories worth every sacrifice, every tear, every fleeting moment. And, as Sarah watched her daughters giggle with Scout, she knew Max was still with them. His amber eyes shining through every act of kindness, every open heart, every step they took together. If you find the story interesting and meaningful, please click follow and like to support me to create more stories. Thank you.